there are really two different sets of issues. One of them is the climate science issue. Is Earth warming? Why? How fast? What could we expect to happen? And the other is the issue of consequences. If it warms by a particular amount, will the results be bad, very bad, good? My own view is that the orthodox position on the climate science is probably about correct. That is, I think there's reason to believe that Earth's temperature has been trending very slowly upwards by about 1 degree centigrade in a century. I think greenhouse gases are at least a plausible explanation of the reason. I have some reservation about the IPCC modeling and projections. My guess is that their projections are higher than what will actually happen, since that seems to have been true of their past projections. But in a general sense, I don't want to argue with that half of the argument. The part that I think is mistaken is the claim that warming on the scale projected by the IPCC can be expected to have negative effects. And there are basically two ways of trying to look at the question. If you ask, given a major change over a long period of time, on net, is it good or bad? And you're talking about a change that clearly will have some negative and some positive effects. One way is a priori. Is there a reason to expect this change to be negative? And the answer is not very much. The current climate was not designed for us. We were not designed for it. And humans currently prosper across a range of climates much larger than the change projected by about 2100. As I like to point out, the IPCC, roughly speaking, is saying that by 2100, Minnesota will have the climate of Iowa. That's not a very large change. The only argument I can see for expecting the effects to be negative is that we are currently optimized against our current environment, so that the crop varieties we grow are those appropriate to the current climate, houses are insulated in some places, air conditioned in others, and so forth. That would be a serious argument against rapid change. But we're talking about change of somewhere around 1/10 of a degree per decade, maybe 2/10 or 3/10 if you're pessimistic. We're talking about sea level rise so far of about 8 inches in a century. That's very, very slow change. Over that period of time, buildings are replaced, crop varieties are changed, so there's no reason to think that adjusting to that change is a significant cost. On the other hand, there are a set of reasons to expect the net effects to be positive. CO2 is an input to plant growth, so increasing the concentration of CO2 can be expected to increase plant production. The changes in temperature are small, but the changes in CO2 concentration are not small. And again, the projections that the IPCC is making are expecting something like a doubling of CO2 concentration by the end of the century. So that's actually quite a significant effect. Longer growing seasons, which you get with warmer climates, are likely to result in more output. If you look at the globe, you observe that human habitation is constrained by cold, not by heat. The equator is populated and the poles are not. So the general effect of raising world temperature will tend to be to increase the amount of the Earth's surface usable by humans. And I did some very rough estimates comparing that effect to the loss of land due to sea level rise. And my rough estimate was that you gain something like 1,000 times as much land as you lose. Not as useful land, it's true, but it's not probably more than 1,000th as useful. Finally, there's a feature of greenhouse gas warming that doesn't get emphasized very much. And that is that on theoretical grounds, we can expect it to be greater in cold places and times than in warm. If people are curious, I can explain the physics which has to do with the interaction between CO2 and water vapor. But that means, since generally speaking warming is good when it's cold and bad when it's hot, that means that the pattern of warming is biased in our favor. That it will do more to make the Arctic habitable than to make the equator uninhabitable, more to make winters milder than to make summers hotter. And as far as I know, no one denies that, but a lot of people choose not to talk about it. So the other attempt, the other possible approach, is to try to add up all of the effects, positive and negative. And that's a very difficult thing to do because we're talking about effects over a century. We don't know what humans will be doing. We don't know a whole lot of stuff. I got into this argument, 40-some years ago in the context of population. when it was widely believed that increased population had large negative effects. I tried to add them up and concluded that I could not sign the sum. I couldn't tell whether having one more child on net made other people a little bit better off or a little bit worse off. I think that's true in this case as well. My guess is that the sum is positive, that warming has net positive effects, but I could easily be wrong about that. And part of the problem when you've got this sort of uncertain thing is if you know what answer you want to get, it's pretty easy to get it. All right, so if you're pretty sure that warming is bad, then you make generous estimates for the negative effects, conservative estimates for the positive effects, and you leave out some of the positive effects because you aren't looking for them very hard. And I actually have one quite specific example of that I go into in detail on my blog. William Nordhaus is one of the small number of economists who has tried to estimate the effect of warming. And in a book he co-authored, happens to be up on the web, which is why I could easily read it, he basically says that the confident results of warming are not very bad. That if only you look at those, you don't have much case for action. But he says we have to include estimates of low probability, high cost effects, of ways in which warming probably won't make things worse, but could make it a lot worse. And he tries to estimate that, and that's obviously a very, very uncertain estimate, but as far as I can tell, it's an honest estimate. It never occurs to him to try to estimate the low probability, high cost consequences of stopping global warming. Or to put it differently, the low probability, high benefit consequences of continued warming. We are currently in interglacial. The situation about, 30,000 years ago had half a mile of ice over the current location of London and Chicago. We do not know why interglacials stop and start, though we have various guesses about it. There is some probability, not I think very much, that global warming is what is keeping this interglacial from ending. And surely when Nordhaus was looking at low probability, high cost consequences, he ought to have included some estimate for the possibility that stopping global warming will bring the ice down again. It didn't occur to him to do that. I can give if you look at my blog, you can find a discussion of a whole lot of these issues. I'm not sure I want to go into it in more detail. But my basic point is that in a case like population or warming, where you have positive effects, negative effects, and they're quite uncertain, it's pretty easy for somebody to construct an analysis that gets the net effect to be negative if you think it's negative, positive if you think it's positive, without any deliberate dishonesty, just by the natural bias of finding what you're expecting to find. So those are the things I wanted to say. Thank you.
Hi, I got, is David Howden here? David, identify yourself, okay. Well, then we'll allot his time to the other speakers. Again, I can go. Yeah. About Mitra. There's a bit of time if you want to say something about yourself, but.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Yeah, 10 minutes?
Yeah.
I just wrote down my 5 points.
Yeah.
I hope I'll finish before. I had been involved in this the debate quite intensively until a few years ago. I mean, very intensively. At some of the IPCC, UNFCCC meetings as well as in India. And I've kind of given up on this issue because I think it doesn't, at least in developing countries, it doesn't hold much water. And but the first thing that I really realized from getting engaged onto this issue is the question that can science be actually used to decide on public policy? Science tells us about the natural world. Science is supposed to be objective about the physical world out there. Can that methodology be really used to decide on questions where human values and preferences and priorities come in? And I think, it actually reminded me, and I started reading bits and pieces of how a country that is no longer there, you started off by trying to create the new man on scientific socialism. And it was a disaster of unimaginable proportion. Science cannot really be used for public policy making. I'm convinced after going through this debate on climate change for more than 10 years. To me, it doesn't so much matter whether the climate is changing or whether anthropogenic or human contribution to it is aggravating the trends. But what does matter is what's the impact on us, because that's what we are valuing. That's on the basis of the impact on us, on people, on societies, rich and poor, that we are trying to take a call on what to do about it. Right? I mean, if it was not the case, we wouldn't be actually thinking about doing anything about it. We think it has an impact on us, and therefore we should do something about it. So let's look at the theory. David already mentioned part of those theories, that the carbon dioxide, the emission of carbon dioxide because of our energy usage, particularly fossil fuel. I don't know how much carbon dioxide is going to be generated, but what I do know is that the world economy has been decarbonizing, and you heard me right. The world economy has been decarbonizing for at least past 500-600 years. It has been decarbonizing. The question is, and there's a professor at Rockefeller University in New York, Jesse Asubel, and you might Google and read more about that. The economy is decarbonizing because we have become, our energy intensity has dropped significantly, and my computer is lying at the back, but if any of you are interested, I can actually show you the trends across countries and regions of the world. That the energy intensity of the economy has been declining in a very secular trend for a few centuries, because our energy efficiency has been rising rapidly, which is why energy as a significant part of our economy has declined. And that's true across the board if you look at anybody's data. I mean, any data that is publicly available, you can do the calculation yourself. That the energy efficiency has simply outstripped the intensity. And the intensity has been falling quite dramatically. For instance, in China and India, in the last 22 years alone, I think the Chinese energy intensity has dropped by more than 40%. For India, it's more than 25%. And coincidentally, this coincides with the period when China and India tried to reform their economies. Haltingly, with a lot of caveats, but nevertheless in a direction that most of us would agree were more towards the market, which suggests that the invisible hand of the market is actually delivering even without knowing what it's delivering, because I would assume that that's what is the unintended consequence, because we don't really use carbon directly. We only think it might make an impact, and if our economies are shifting, then should we really need to worry about carbon? And the US, I think the largest emitter of carbon, actually has plateaued in the last 2 years. So something is happening. You could say the gas revolution, the fracking and all that has done it. But whatever it is, that's been always the trend, like when the human society moved from wood to coal and coal to the rest. That's been the trend. And gas today has just been part of that trend. The same thing I can suggest with the same degree of confidence, because I again had done the data crunching on agriculture. That agriculture in poorer countries have improved greatly in the last 30-40 years, India, China being another two very big examples. Consequently, India, for instance, the amount of land under agriculture has been declining since about the late 1980s, which means we are producing much more, in fact more than double, from the 1980s level to today, from less land under agriculture than before. Again, this is nothing spectacular. The developed countries had done it 50, 100 years ago. For instance, United States is still one of the world's largest agriculture producer, but United States today has more trees standing than agricultural cropland. And that's again been true across the board in most countries across the world. Another thing I was looking at, and something actually I got interested in this not because of these two trends, but because of another issue that was highlighted earlier during the climate debate, because it used to be called global warming. You know, the climate change was a later nomenclature. It started off with global warming, and global warming implied that the world is going to become warmer and drier, and droughts would prevail, and I was looking at droughts. So I tried to look at historically recorded droughts in India for the last 1,000 years, and I looked at some of the major droughts over the last century. The Irish famine in Europe, perhaps the last major natural drought aggravated by human failures. And the Indian, the most major catastrophic one was just about 20 years after the Irish famine in the late 1870s. And the last one in India was in 1965-66. In both these incidents, estimates range between 2 to 3 million people, dying because of sheer hunger. But we haven't had that in India for the last 40 years, 50 years. So something has changed, which means it doesn't matter so much whether the climate is changing. The world is able to, or societies are able to insulate themselves from the natural vagaries of nature much more than before, and the way to do it is with economic development and technological adaptations. The only caveat is that the past is not necessarily going to be the future. But even a bigger caveat then should be applied to those who are projecting the future without actually being able to explain the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Julian will speak next for about 10 minutes.
I'm the odd one out on this panel, and the reason was given in advance when I warned against having me, because I am very disinterested in the climate debate. I have an idea that what the three other panelists will have said so far, I've agreed with everything, but then I'm not an expert on the subject, so my agreement is of no particular value or relevance to them. And the reason I'm not interested in it is because I've spent too much of my life chasing after the current scare story, the current catastrophism that the world supposedly faces, doing all the number crunching, reading all the literature, wondering about overpopulation, wondering about AIDS, wondering about whether crime is rising, alcoholism, and so on and so forth. There seems to me to be a more interesting sociological phenomenon here, and maybe an economic and political one, than a scientific one. And so I am not going to be making any comments about the science, although if you ask my opinion privately, I'll give them. But I wouldn't regard them as being as valid as you'll get from many other people at this conference. What is to me more interesting is why there is a human preference for catastrophism. Why human beings love scare stories. Why human beings love being told the sky is falling. Catastrophe is about around the corner. Imminent danger is at hand. Extreme action is needed to save us. And I'm going to choose one simply because I come from very close to where the highest incidence of AIDS, HIV/AIDS in the world, is meant to be, namely in the Tugela Basin of a part of South Africa called KwaZulu, or KZN, which is the poorest part of South Africa, and there is meant to be the highest incidence of full-blown AIDS in the world. Well, I went to go and investigate it at the time, and I went to a clinic in one of the villages and said, I'm here investigating AIDS, and I was told, well, fortunately, it hasn't really struck us, it's in all the other villages. So I went to one of the others, and every village to which I went, I was told by the local clinic, we are lucky, we've escaped, all the other villages have this AIDS pandemic. And I then looked at a couple of other numbered data, and I'm talking about AIDS, not climate, and I will see in a moment why. Because if you look at, for example, Uganda was meant to have the highest HIV as opposed to AIDS rate in the world. We were told the HIV rate fell from about 30% to about 7%, thanks to their policies, but we were also told there's no cure for HIV. That meant something like 23% or so of the population must have died for that amount of AIDS HIV to disappear. In fact, what happened, it had one of the highest population growth rates in the world during the period during which everyone was meant to be dying. The same is true of Botswana next to us, which is meant to have the second highest rate. South Africa the highest. The populations just kept growing at about the highest rates of population growth in the world. So after spending a great deal of time and effort investigating and researching the AIDS scare story, I concluded, well, that it was something happening, but it was nothing that you could remotely call a pandemic, and the numbers were vastly exceeded. David mentioned the issue of the population scare and all the scare stories relating to it. And now we have global warming, and as Barun has pointed out, David is satisfied that there's long-term warming, but anyway, after the IPCC said and made confident predictions about warming, it simply stopped, and so now they no longer talk about warming but change. Now let me say, when people ask my view on climate change, I said, yes, absolutely, I'm in favor of it. I think there always has been climate change, there always will be climate change, and there always should be climate change. Climate change is a very good idea. I'm in favor of there being climate change. I think it is extremely delusional to believe that there is much we human beings can do about it. That we are going to suddenly bring the world to some kind of freeze, that we're going to stop climate change all of a sudden. I doubt that that's going to happen. What I think is more interesting is what divides us and why you will have at a libertarian conference climate change skeptics, David who buys into it, Barun who largely doesn't, Mary who I think probably doesn't, but nonetheless all saying whichever way you look at it, it's not particularly serious and there shouldn't be a great panic around the world at great cost to humanity, especially in poor countries. As was that my 10-minute alarm? No. Okay, it was a 5-minute alarm. So, well, I'm not being very alarming, I'm sorry to say. But what will happen is that why do all of the free market, libertarian and mostly conservative institutes around the world, all, if you visit their websites, almost uniformly, close to 100%, are climate change skeptics. They also were skeptics over things like the amount of damage tobacco is meant to cause and many, many other issues. What divides us is the people who want more government intervention and control and people who want more freedom and liberty. People who want freedom and liberty tend to be climate change skeptics, not because of anything to do with science, because of something to do with the philosophy and belief in freedom and not wanting big brother government to control more and more of our lives. That is my view of why we have this clear divide. Leftist or socialist or dirigist or communist institutes, think tanks, policy institutes around the world, to them, climate change is the most scary thing that has ever happened. It is not actually. For them, it is the most wonderful thing. It is the latest excuse for more and more and more big government. Now, why are some of us just generally skeptical about scare stories, quite apart from being libertarian? Scare stories are always and everywhere an excuse for more government control and less liberty. But there is another type of person, and I'm one of those, who's generally skeptical. In other words, when I heard about the AIDS epidemic, I was inclined to be doubtful about it. I went to the trouble of actually traveling around and doing the investigation and the research and giving talks and doing number crunching and pointing out there was no such pandemic. In fact, the populations were growing and very, very few people were in fact dying of AIDS in the place where it was meant to be the highest in the world. So I think some of us like scare stories. If I tell you, for example, that the rate of child rape in Indonesia is the highest in the world, at a dinner party in Indonesia, people will say, oh really, that really is terrible, yes, I've heard about it, I've read about it, and so on. Or if I say that in America or Germany or somewhere, people will tend to be inclined. Now, I can tell you, I've done a research, I've gone sort of personal, non-scholarly research. I go to meetings and dinner parties, and I say to people something absolutely objectively true. Rhinos and elephants are not endangered and have never been endangered. Okay? In fact, the quantity of rhinos, despite all of the poaching, has been increasing over the last 3-4 decades. There are more and more rhinos. Now, when I say that, you would think people would be relieved, and I cite the sources and I give them the data. You'd think they'd say, wow, gee, I'm pleased to hear that. That means I no longer have to make donations to the Save the Rhino Fund. No, they hate it. I never get invited back again. You have to tell people that more rhinos are being killed than ever before. And they're endangered. And eagles are endangered. And I don't know, there's more rape than ever before. And there's more. If you tell terrible stories, people love you. I don't know why. It's very peculiar. But if you go to dinner parties and you tell people, you know, I heard from David Friedman that we actually don't have to worry about global warming, you will not be invited back again. You have to tell them it's worse than you thought. Even David Friedman thinks there's global warming. Now, that's really a reason to be terrified. So I really want to say that I don't think it's about science. I think it's a human predilection for believing bad stories, and I have an entire theory called the Russell in the grass hypothesis as to why human beings are more inclined to believe bad stories, skies falling stories, than inclined to believe good stories. I think there's a good Darwinian reason for that, and that, in my view, whether or not there's climate change is close to pretty much irrelevant. Human beings can, as has been pointed out, live under pretty much any climate. Doesn't really matter, and it's something we shouldn't worry about. But you will not be popular if you go and tell other people that.
Thank you. Thank you, Leon. Thanks for keeping the time.
Well, I do have an opinion on climate change, but I'm not going to share that right now because that's not the point of my talk. Basically, I think the point is that if someone believes in global warming, it's going to take a lot to convince them that it isn't true. And even if you convince them of that, they still may say, well, just as a precaution, we really should limit fossil fuel consumption. And that's why I want to talk about other options if there were climate change. And I think right now it's a little difficult to tell because the science is erratic. So let me share with you some ideas on that, because I think that that's where the rubber meets the road in our discussions. Cutting back on fossil fuel emissions is very punishing. And if you actually implemented some of the treaties that have been suggested, what it would essentially do is really slow the developed world down and devastate the developing world. I mean, we're talking about people dying, starving. It would set them back so far that the results would be devastating. So I don't think that is the best way to go. And I think simply on a humanitarian basis, you certainly want to be thinking of other possibilities. And the good news is there are many other possibilities, and that's the angle I'd like to take with you. For example, one of the big scares right now is too much carbon dioxide. And you know, we're all guilty because we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So, I mean, do we kill ourselves off so that the carbon dioxide won't change? Of course, that's ridiculous. I'm just pointing out that there really isn't any way to limit that. When we burn fossil fuels, yes, there's carbon dioxide emitted, but there's something good going on. Carbon dioxide is fertilizer for plants, as has been mentioned earlier. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they exude oxygen. So they help us out. If they weren't there, we'd be in big trouble. And so the higher the carbon dioxide level goes, the more plant life will thrive. It's hard to see that as a bad thing. But also within that is a possible solution if we thought it was a bad thing, and that is to change carbon dioxide emissions. All we need to do is have more plants. Now that's a pretty simple solution. And there's different ways to do that. We can plant more plants. Or we can go large scale and do something like fertilize the oceans, because plankton, which is very prevalent in oceans, a small little microorganism that basically puts out, maybe microorganism isn't the right term, a small plant, one-celled plant, does what other plants do. It breathes in carbon dioxide and puts out oxygen. So if you fertilize the oceans, for example, you might be able to increase plant life in the oceans enough that you could counterbalance an effect like that. I'm not sure I would want to go that grand of a route myself. I don't think it's needed, but there are other options, and that's the message I'm trying to convey. The other way to go, of course, and Barum kind of alluded to it, is you can change what you're doing so that you use fossil fuels more efficiently, or even replace them. You know, back in the days when Rockefeller was trying to refine oil and make oil very inexpensive so that even the poor people could basically have nightlight and have a night life, so to speak. He was actually helping the environment because at the time, what the wealthy people did was they used whale oil to light their lamps, and whales were becoming extinct. Well, with the advent of refining of oil, the refining of like petroleum oil, the whale oil was no longer necessary, and so whales, which had almost been hunted to extinction, basically were allowed to come back and flourish. So substituting through innovation what we're using now, if it indeed created a problem, is another and better way to take care of the problem. And finally, as you probably all are aware, the world is getting wealthier and wealthier. Now, it may not be quite as wealthy as we'd all like. Maybe not, we might not be personally the recipient of all that wealth, but we know if we look at the statistics that the world is getting wealthier. And that's because we're learning every day how to create more wealth out of the resources we have. And by wealth, I'm meaning food, clothing, medicine. You know, the world is getting richer, which means that if there are global warming effects that will affect people 50 years down the road, at that time, people will be wealthier. They will be more in a better position to put up dikes or whatever they have to do to counter whatever the effects of global climate change might be. And again, this was alluded to too, that we adapt better these days. We are learning how to adapt to any changes so that we don't need to worry about them. So if we cut back on fossil fuels today and impoverish ourselves today, what we are doing is impoverishing the future generations that are actually going to have to deal with this problem, because no matter how much we cut back, it's not going to decrease the carbon. What we've been told, according to the calculations, is the best we can hope for by really cutting back is maybe to slow it down a little bit or maybe to cause it to plateau. So having a cutback in fossil fuels isn't going to really solve the problem at all. And one of the reasons it won't is because there's an exemption in all of these treaties. The US military. It doesn't have to cut back, and it's the number one agency that uses the most fossil fuel of all. So obviously, there's some problems with the solution of cutting back on fossil fuels. And I think we as market-minded people can certainly make arguments that even if we have a problem with climate change, there are solutions that don't impoverish us, especially don't impoverish the developing nations, and really help us all have a better world. Thank you.
Okay, it's called cartoon. Okay, well, I wasn't impolite about not introducing them, but as a speaker myself, I would rather have the extra time to speak rather than be introduced. But Madhu Mitra is from New Delhi, with the president, I suppose, of the Liberty Institute. I may get the title wrong, but he is the Liberty Institute. He speaks around the world on a lot of conservation issues, but he's doing amazingly important work in India, and his project is one of the real activist libertarian projects I know in the world. Because this is something my students always ask me, what can we do that, I want to be an activist, but libertarians will tell people to not have, depend so much on government, and then they go away and maybe they become leftists or something. But Varun is helping the people, the poor people of India, identify their private property so that they can mobilize what would have been dead capital in their hands. So this is a critical thing, I think, and it's to be applauded. Quickly, Leon Lowe is, again, executive director or president of the Free Market Foundation in South Africa. I've known both of them for many, many years. I followed Leon's work. We along with Francis and a few others, helped bring down apartheid in South Africa, we like to think somehow, by introducing the free market argument. David Friedman, who spoke first, wrote a book that may inspire most of you, if not all of you, The Machinery of Freedom. If you haven't read that, that's where you should go now. He's a professor of law and economics at San Jose in California. He, by the way, is not an economist. He is was trained as a world-class mathematician, as I am. Physicist, okay. So, Anne Mary Ruart was introduced earlier, so I won't dwell on that. So David wanted to show you...
I want to show some evidence for Leon's argument. And it's evidence provided by the opposition, which is why it's good evidence. This is a cartoon which is very popular with people who are arguing against global warming. And what does that say? It says global warming is an argument for doing a whole lot of things we want to do anyway. And it never occurs to the people who put up that cartoon that they've just told everyone else in the world not to trust them. Because it's very easy to believe arguments for things you want to do.
Okay, and if any of you want to make follow-up statements, otherwise we'll move on to questions. Do you want to fill in? Make it brief.
I mean, some of you may already know, but I think basically what I was talking about was the Kuznets curve applied on environment. Simon Kuznets, 1955, had a very interesting paper, and in the World Bank in 1992 used it on environmental issues to say that as income increases, first the environmental problems might become more serious, but after a point it comes down and the income keeps increasing. So there's an inverted U kind of a curve, and it applies, in my view. I've tried to test it out on some of the issues, including the rhinos and the elephants, and it seems to work.
Okay, now we'll take questions. Stand up and so we can hear you. Speak loudly, please. I won't try the microphone. It's a disaster.
One of the more compelling pieces of data for global warming, if you look carefully, might be the size of women's bathing suits over
That's another cartoon. Yeah, that's
Well, I had a question for Leon, and that is, given that governments really like catastrophism because it fuels all the things they want to do to grow, would you put global terrorism in the same class as catastrophism?
Yeah, could you restate the question if you understand it?
Yes, the question was, since governments like catastrophism and exaggerate it and fabricate it, would I say that they're doing the same regarding global terrorism? And I have to say this, that I've become kind of tired of checking the data, because I've done it now for 45 years and it's always the same answer, is that the catastrophism has been exaggerated or commonly simply fabricated. In other words, there is no basis for it at all. Frequently it's an exaggeration. And I have the same sense of terrorism. I think if we were to actually get the data, the number of people killed by politically motivated acts of terror or insurrection, bearing in mind that when the terrorists win, they're called freedom fighters or liberators. But if you nonetheless define terrorism as all violent action to overthrow a current regime, if you give it an as close as possible to an objective definition, I would be very surprised if there is a significantly greater quantity now than, say, 10 or 15 or 30 or 40 years ago. And I just want to point out that I come from a continent, a few of us and Indonesia and others, India, Burun, which fought against colonialism. And the regimes that are now in power were all once terrorists. And terrorism was the norm. It was in almost every country. My wife is a Kenyan. She grew up in Kenya with the Mau Mau, famous Mau Mau. And so in South Africa we had the struggle and so on and so forth. So I would think, I would place bets, let's put it this way. I haven't looked at the data. But if you're asking me how would I place my bet, I would place my bet on the amount of terrorism now being less than it was, for example, 50 years ago.
Question. That quick hand there. Stand, please, so we can hear you. Enunciate yourself so they can hear you.
I understand the issue, particularly addressed to Friedman. I understand the issue a lot about the climate change science being used for political purposes and the data being wrong and so on and so forth. But the concept of an emissions trading system, of having an externality costed and then letting the market fight for that, is actually a very libertarian, market-driven concept. So just the notion of taxing of externalities and letting the market deal with it, whether it's climate change, whether it's fatty foods, whether it's guns or chocolate, what are your thoughts about that?
So, coping with the externality. David?
I would agree that as a general rule, Pigouvian tax is a more sensible way of dealing with an externality than direct regulation, which is the usual alternative. But 2 points. First, in order to do that, you have to know the sign and at least roughly the size of the externality. If, as I've been suggesting, the externality is positive, then imposing a Pigouvian tax imposes net damage because it reduces a good thing. And the second point is that, as far as I can tell, as a matter of politics, one is very unlikely to get a clean Pigouvian tax. Because we did an experiment on this with global warming in the US. The House passed a cap and trade bill. And cap and trade is basically the same thing as a Pigouvian tax, except that the income is allocated to the previous polluters instead of to the government. But it economically is very much the same. But if you looked at that bill, along with cap and trade, there were a bunch of additional regulations. So that once it was not in fact doing what you want to do, which is getting it so that you have a market decision instead. And I was actually arguing with a moderately prominent economist who is a strong believer in Pigouvian taxes by email at the time. And I asked him whether he thought the bill that had actually passed the House, it didn't pass the Senate, would have been an improvement on nothing, and he was not willing to say it would have been.
Stand up, please, and speak loudly.
My name is Julian Mahaganti from Indonesia, around here. I don't know if it's a question, maybe a suggestion, maybe because I think there's a lot of negativity in the force when two of our panelists speak. I think they lost hope. One refused to state his theory, another one stopped believing in science in making public policy. So I think we just go back from Kuta. We are sponsored by EFN to talk about climate change, and there we come up with some of the what happened in the past, like for example Simon Ehrlich bet. So we libertarians tend to like to bet because, you know, wager, Simon Ehrlich wager, when they bet about five commodities, yes. So we really like to bet, and most of the time we win. So it really cheers us up. So like you said before, if I need to bet, I will bet for. So if I think it's not just rhetoric, let's make a real bet. I make a real bet some weeks ago because in Indonesia we have another scary story that people like. We call it bahaya narkoba, you know, the emergency of the drugs. So I said after the death of the Australian, I make a bet that in the 2017, 2 years from now, the number of the, if we still in the same policy, the number of the drugs user will increase, and the number of the money laundering from the drugs crime will also increase. So I think I bet 400,000 with my friends. I post in the Facebook. I said to all of them, let's bet. Why 400,000? Because I will pay. If I promise 2 billion rupiah, I will not have that money. So to cheer us up, let's bet. That's just a suggestion.
You want to respond to that? For the Julian Simon bet.
That is the problem with betting in these contexts is it's very hard to define what you're betting on. And in fact, there was a bet offered by some people on the pro-warming side to some people on the anti-warming side. But if you look carefully at the bet, it was one that the people offering it would win even if they were wrong. Because the bet they made was about the 30-year average of global temperatures. So the question was whether the 30-year average next year would be higher than the 30-year average this year. And the people they were betting with were people who thought that warming had stopped in 1998. Well, if temperatures were going up until 1998 and were flat since then when you shift the 30-year over one, you're dropping a year well before 1998, adding a current year, and it's going to go up even if they're right. So more generally, I mean, I don't know any way I could set up a useful bet for my beliefs, because you'd have to have some kind of a clear measure of net gains, net losses, and people would disagree about that.
The other problem with global warming is not all of the measurements show the same things. If you look at the satellite data, it tends to, not really support the idea that we're warming. If you look at the surface data, on the other hand, it looks like we're warming quite a bit. And there have been discussions about whether or not that trend is because all of the temperature measuring devices on the Earth's surface are increasingly in an area which is built up, urbanized, in other words. Back when they were first installed, they might have been out in a rural area, but as development occurs, now they're in a city, so it makes a big difference. And there's been a lot of controversy about whether that's true or not. But the fact of the matter is it's impossible to correct for such things in a really, validated way, in a way that everybody can agree is a good way. So there's a lot of variables, including measuring the temperature itself.
Leon?
Yes, if I can just mention Julian Simon. As it happens, I had a long walk with him down the beach at Cannes at the Mont Pelerin meeting there some years ago, and we were discussing his bet with Paul Ehrlich, which he won. For those who don't know, that he was saying resource prices would fall, and Ehrlich said they would rise at the time of the catastrophism about resource shortage. That was another one of these scare stories that turned out to be nonsense. And what we agreed is that he and I would actually be willing to place a bet against anyone who predicts anything getting worse anywhere. And he wrote a book called Everything's Getting Better, I'll Bet on It. He never finished it. He died prematurely and someone else completed it, so it's available, and I encourage everybody to have a look at the book, Everything's Getting Better, I'll Bet on It. And what our idea was is that we would say to anybody who wants to bet against us, you make the prediction of something you think will get worse. Anything, any environmental or human condition that you predict getting worse. We will bet on it getting better. Anything. And I have had about 20 such bets. Julian Simon had many. I've lost one, which was a prediction that there would be an increase in diabetes in the United States. That was the only one I lost. But all of the others so far I've won. And I've won for a very good reason. It's quite interesting why one wins. Because people always bet on something that is already bad getting worse. That's the big mistake. That's the opposite of the bet you must place. They should rather bet on the rate of murder going up in Switzerland or something, you see. Not the rate of genocide going up in Rwanda. That's the worst bet to place. So if you place bets, the kind people will place, for example, on climate change getting worse, yes, I will bet against it. We will get David to give us a nice objective measure, and we will get Mary to keep the money because I won't trust you to pay when you lose.
David pointed out, you have to sort of set the terms of reference very clearly, so you're not disadvantaged. This hand went up first. Regis? Make it short, please. There are many other hands. He gave you a live mic, just to speak.
Hi, I like to introduce the case of Japan. When we talking about global warming, one of the causes is increase of CO2. And in Japan, it is a fashion to make a environment tax. And
we want a question, though. No, I'm sorry. The panel's giving a talk. Let's move to a question.
It's a problem to find out who can solve this question before discussion, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Branson. Anybody else? Let me know.
Hey, I have a question. Don't you think, in general, it would be wiser for the liberty movement to let actual climate scientists who are qualified to speak on the subject, let them determine what the science is, and we should focus more on, is a free market solution better, or is government solution better? It seems like we should focus more on the normative claim and not the actual empirical claim, because most of us are not, in fact, climate scientists, and it seems that they're more qualified than us to speak about the subject. And if most of them happen to agree on this issue, it seems like their opinions are more relevant.
Yes, I mean, that was kind of my point, is that if we try to, I mean, I have looked at the climate data, as a scientist, I have some opinions, but as I said, you're not going to really convince anyone. But what you do want to talk about is the potential solutions, because that's where the damage is.
Okay. The other thing is, many of them are not climate scientists. They use their people.
The question is, what do you think the claim is that most climate scientists agree on? Can you state what you think the claim is that only you have agreement on?
Anthropogenic climate change.
But that isn't enough to give any implication, because that doesn't tell you how fast it is, nor does it tell you whether the consequences are good or bad. If you go on my blog, one of my favorite blog posts has to do with the origin of the 97% claim that's widely made. And if you actually read that paper, even assuming it's an honest paper, which for various reasons I don't, but assuming it is, the 97% is for papers that hold that humans contribute to climate change. The lead author of that paper, in a later paper, claimed the 97% was for people who believe that humans are the main cause of climate change. If you read his paper, what his data give for main cause, it's principal cause, I think is the term he uses, which is not reported in the paper to be calculated from the web data, is 1.6%. Then further people take it over, and they claim it's 97% saying that humans are the main cause and the results will be terrible, which isn't anywhere in the original paper that's being cited. So that you get a heavily biased view of what the scientific opinions are. And I think that's true in a whole lot of other ways. For example, you get repeated claims about increased death rates due to heat. One of the people I was arguing with online very recently pointed me at an IPCC page that discussed a little bit not only heat, but reduced cold. Their figure for England was that their estimate of increased mortality from increased temperature was 1/10 as large as their estimate of decreased mortality from cold. That is not a figure you will often hear. That was for England specifically. It's not clear if it's true everywhere. But so all I'm saying is that knowing what, quote, these scientists say is not trivial. I also have a web page you might want. My blog is called Ideas, and I discuss the general question of how to form opinions about areas where you're not an expert. And it's not a trivial process, because all of us get filtered data. All of us get shown a subset of the papers and articles that fits whoever is showing it to us. Unless you are, I'm more competent to evaluate it than most people. I'm trained as a physicist, I'm function as an economist, I've taught elementary statistics, those are three of the things that go into it. There's still no way that I can really read most of the papers that go into reaching conclusions about this. And most people are much worse off. So almost everybody is going on second and third and fourth hand information, and then the problem is how do you evaluate that? And I discuss that in my blog post. It's a hard problem, but an interesting one.
Do you suppose there's a reason why...
Wait. Next question? Yeah.
My name is Anirudh and I live in Cambodia. It's a place where foreign governments are really active in advocacy for climate change. There are millions of dollars spent on projects in Southeast Asia advocating climate change, getting grassroots organizations together and people, convincing people that climate change is real, and let's have less rapid economic development, and let's do something in these developing countries so as to protect them from whatever is happening. So how do libertarians address this issue? And is there a theory which I would like to ask the panelists? Do they have a theory for why world governments are so interested and invested in promoting these ideas, especially in third world countries where people need to be free and prosperous using the market mechanisms? Thank you.
May I make just a quick remark? I was invited to Bhutan, which suffers the same sort of consequence. Roughly 40% of the government budget comes from NGOs and foreign governments. They asked me to come and debate about climate change with a United Nations representative. And I saw very clearly why they have such a strong interest. She arrived in a brand new Land Rover with a staff of 2 or 3 people to carry her bags and stuff. They had a live feed with somebody in Bangkok and someone in South Africa to filter questions to her because she was worried that she wouldn't have the competence. Right? I showed up with a laptop. And I said, the claims are that there are vested interests, like the oil companies or whatever, that promote skepticism. But, I'm waiting for my checks. I came in without, so I won that debate very easily, just on those grounds. They looked at where the interest lay. And it was these people securing their jobs and supporting this very large and expensive organization.
We've been given a signal by the organizer that we're at our break time. One apology first. Leon had a health issue that he had an appointment at a hospital with that he had to go to, and he extends his apology that he wasn't able to complete the discussion here on this.
Let me ask you to thank the panelists.